So what's the plan here? You want to have some responses? Yeah. Do you want to handle this, David, so you can just call on people and they don't feel like I'm spurning them if they have their hand up and I'm not calling on them?
I see that hand right there.
Yes, sir.
Question.
Race and religion? What's that have to do with Dixie? One of the things I learned when I was working in the civil rights movement, which I had the great privilege of working with Dr. King for a number of years, is that he said frequently, as a son of Atlanta, the South is going to get through this before you folks in the North do. He said that. And he was fully aware of the fact that racial discrimination and racial bigotry was not the monopoly of any particular region. Now, it got more institutionalized and legalized here and uglier in some ways, but believe me, this is not a local malady at all. I think we're on the right road in dealing with race, and part of it, I think, is that it's awfully hard to stereotype people and to marginalize people when you know them as people. When you don't see them, when they're not in your school, when they're not in your workplace, when they're not living in your neighborhood, it's easier. Whatever they are, whether Latinos or they're Asians or black people or whatever, it's easier to subsume them under some idea you have of that. When they are a part of the community, then this checks this kind of stereotyping. And I see that happening more and more everywhere. I was just in Birmingham a couple days ago. Now, Birmingham, as I don't have to say, it doesn't have a very good reputation, at least historically in this field. But Birmingham is a transformed city in many ways. And people in Birmingham are aware that they are kind of making up for the rather ugly picture that was painted of them, and quite legitimately when the fire hoses and dogs were out. They're doing something much more constructive. The black churches and white churches are working together. They're going to be marking this year and next year the 50th anniversary of those events in Birmingham. So maybe I'm innocent about this, but I am, look, we have a black president who was reelected to the United States. Could that have happened 20, 30, 40 years ago, whether you agree with his politics or not? There he is. And that must say something about the movement, the progress we're making. We're not there yet at all. No, that's true. But I'm very, very hopeful about this, about what's happening on that front. And I hope my hopefulness is well-grounded. Now, you can take some wonderful gift that's been given you, which I think the gospel is, and you can mess it up pretty badly. Human beings have this tendency to mess these things up, and it's called original sin in theology. And alas, I'm a believer in original sin. I wish there weren't such a thing, but there it is. And it's, as my old friend Bill Coffin used to say, original sin means nothing ever stays fixed. You fix it and then it isn't fixed, because somehow or another we generate ways to undermine the best. However, look, we have some hopeful signs in that regard too. Whatever the ecumenical movement is about, it's about churches searching for things that they have in common rather than bickering over things that they don't have in common. Now, yeah, it's not totally fully successful, but it's made some progress in that regard. And I hope we continue. Now, the next big step, of course, from the historic Christian ecumenical movement is to begin thinking about what some people call the larger ecumenism, which is now we have not just Baptist and Pentecostal neighbors, we have Muslim and Buddhist neighbors, including here in Huntsville. You don't have to go the whole way across the ocean to find a mosque nowadays. Now, they may not have built a mosque here yet, but it will happen as your Muslim neighbors grow in numbers. And it will be good for all of us. Now, let me give an illustration of this, which I find very, very, very hopeful. 3 or 4 years ago, a large group of Muslim religious thinkers and leaders published a full-page ad in several newspapers around the country, the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and others, which they called Common Ground. And the whole advertisement was a plea to Christian leaders, theologians, pastors, and others, to enter into a conversation with Muslims to search for what we have in common. What we have in common, so that we can work together and not concentrate entirely on the things that divide us. Now, Muslims, you know, they have in the Quran, they have Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Jesus. They revere Jesus in the Quran and Jesus' mother, Mary, and stem from the Abrahamic tradition, the way we do and the way our Jewish brothers and sisters do. So there is some common ground. And they published that. I think there were like 100 signatures on it. I remember seeing it and being astonished when I opened my paper one morning. It was their initiative, not ours. Then a professor from Yale, his name is Wolf, called me on the phone and said, you know, we can't leave this unanswered. His name is Miroslav Wolf. He comes from a Serbian background. He's a theologian who started out as a Pentecostal. He's now a Methodist. That's what happens to Pentecostals when they get a little education, when they calm down a bit. He said, we can't leave this unanswered. Look, these people are... So we got together, and some of us, with his leadership, I was just cooperating, got some funding and sponsored a meeting at Yale. That's a little college down the road from us there. Called Common Ground. And we brought together some Christian leaders, pastors, theologians, and Muslims, equal numbers, and we sat there for 2 or 3 days to try to map out what can we do together. Things like feeding the hungry, or doing something about the ecological crisis, or do some peacemaking. There are things we can do together. And bracket for the moment some of the theological differences, which are not insignificant. I'm not saying they are, but look for the common ground. I think that's what you're asking about, isn't it? See how we can do it if we work at it, and if we listen to other people and they listen to us. I'm a great believer in the power of that kind of dialogue, and we need it now in a broader way than just the Christian ecumenical enterprise. If somebody referred to me as a religious man like Abraham Lincoln, what would I say to that? Well, I would certainly be complimented about that. Whoops, I mean, I'm told Abraham Lincoln isn't quite as popular in this part of the country as he is where... Abraham Lincoln never belonged to a church, and yet most of his biographers and historians suggest that he may have been the most deeply Christian of any president we've ever had. He anguished over the issues that brought us to the Civil War. He anguished over the blood and sacrifice during the Civil War, and he anguished over the fact that both sides, as he said, were praying to the same God, and suffered deeply through all of that. But he believed that somehow, even through suffering and defeat, or because both sides, in the Civil War, both sides were defeated, I think we have to say, given the horrible losses of life on both sides. Even through that, God is able somehow to work something out. And he's a guy who really believed in providence. He couldn't have kept going if he didn't believe in providence in that way. He had apparently as a young man, he did read the Bible a lot, but he just didn't ever get around to joining a church. Maybe he was spiritual but not religious, what some of our young people say today. Maybe he was maybe he was a predecessor of some of the people I'm talking about here, who don't like creeds or institutions, but they like the central message of the Bible and of Jesus. Yeah, the Pew Foundation does these very valuable surveys of religious and other attitudes. And they're very thoroughly done, and they do them frequently, and they announce the results. And when they ask people about religious affiliation, what seems to be happening is that there's a slight, ever so slight decline in the number of people who are affiliated with or belong to churches, religious institutions of any kind, not just churches. Going down a little bit, but not precipitously. There are very, very few people who want to be considered atheists. Tiny, tiny percentage, which doesn't change. It doesn't really get any larger. But there's a larger and larger group who just say not affiliated. They call them, in this survey, they call them nuns. N-O-E. N-O-N-E, nuns. No affiliation. Now, notice that these are not people who want to say no to spirituality or even to religion, perhaps. They are the people I'm talking about. The people who are distrustful of imposed creeds, of hierarchies, of putting the belief before the experience. I know these kids. They're mainly young people, by the way, in these surveys. These are people under 30. I've lived with them for the last 20 or 30 years. And I can assure you, their search is a real one. They are really looking earnestly. And I think that's a good thing. I remember this student who said to me a few years ago, he said, in order to understand us, Professor Cox, you have to know about how you buy books on Amazon.com. He said you go through and you indicate all these various books, and at a certain point you press a button that says, put in basket. He said, you have to understand that we are still in the search mode. We're not ready to put it in the basket yet. We're in search mode. Fine. There's nothing wrong with being in search mode. I think it's a good thing to be in. I think all of us ought to be in some way still in search mode. We found something that's very valuable, and that's where we start out from, but we're still open. We're still looking. We're in search mode. So I think these folks, especially these young people, many of whom I've taught, many of whom you know, many of them are your children, who haven't turned off the spiritual life or the Christian faith, but have their doubts about the scaffolding through which it's come to us. This is a whole potential constituency if the churches could just come up to the challenge and meet these folks in a way that doesn't turn them off. And we have to think of ways to be able to do that. And I think there are some ways to do it. I've seen some churches doing this and doing it. Part of it has to do with creating the kind of venues in which people can feel welcome to raise their questions, their criticisms, their doubts, without being frowned upon or told off in one way or another. When they feel genuinely welcome to do that, and you know, and have some people around there who can respond to them and talk to them and share with them, but create a dialogical situation. Now there are lots of churches, for example, who are opening coffee houses that serve that very purpose. I visited 2 or 3, and I was in one just a few weeks ago up in New York City, a coffee house run by a church with church members staffing it, and people wander in all the time. They know what it is. They know it's a church coffee house. They know that when you go in there, you can talk about trivial things, or you can raise some of these questions, and there are people there who will listen and respond to you thoughtfully. You can also buy a very good cappuccino in that coffee house, so it attracts people like that as well. Now that's only one possible way to do this, but I think you see what I mean. There's a lot about even the architecture of churches or the structure of our worship services that seems to be not welcoming to this kind of searching mood, which could be tweaked and altered in a way that makes people feel more welcome, I think. We could do it if we really wanted to, if we really wanted to do that. And I think it's a richly potential audience or constituency for churches if we could manage it. This is a very, very good question about the future direction of our culture, which I suppose you're speaking about mainly North American culture, with its basis in Christianity. As we become more religiously diverse, what does this do to the, I think you mentioned the word social contract. I think our social contract, for various reasons, is endangered at this point. I think there are just a lot of people who, for one reason or another, don't feel that they are, that the contract is being honored, and that some people are getting too much, some people are getting too little, and that the institutions are set up such that it's not fair, and we need to rethink and reformulate that social contract. I rather agree with that. I am not as worried as you might be about what the religious diversity might do to the culture. Certainly, the social contract is sustained by the culture. Without the culture, it would be inoperative. But when I think about these, the Muslims that I've met in this dialogue, for example, who are one of the immigrant groups, well, they share many of the same values that we have that could feed into our culture. Now, there's a small group of Muslims that we all know about who are the jihadists, but that's a tiny, tiny minority who are marginal to the entire worldwide Muslim population. I have Buddhist students in my classes. I have Muslim students, Jewish students, and I'm always struck by how, even though we have theologies which can be quite disparate, there's an amazing consensus at the level of values among these young people who are presumably going to be leaders. I was reading in the New York Times, I guess today, the column by David Brooks about the American work ethic and how we celebrate the American work ethic as coming from Protestantism. Protestant descent, to some extent that's true. But he pointed out that in many surveys that are done, the Asians who are coming to America and the Latinos have a stronger work. They believe even more strongly in work, and that work gets you ahead. If you work honestly, and you're going to get it. So apparently we Protestants don't have a monopoly on the work ethic either. I thought we did. One more thing lost to us. We're now only 49% of the population, so easy come, easy go. So I don't see a lethal threat myself to the cultural underpinnings of a democracy from religious diversity. To cheer you up, remember that in the early years of the Republic, our Republic, when these ideas were formulated that form our basic culture, the religions that we now think, that religious denominations that we now think of as being so amicable, like the churches that sponsored this, were not so amicable. I mean, in Massachusetts, we were still chasing Quakers down to Rhode Island and hanging witches and things. Or Baptists were not welcome in the Massachusetts in those days, just before the Declaration of Independence, and even after. For 20 years after the Constitution, there was still an established church in Massachusetts until they got around to saying, no, the First Amendment also applies to states and not just to the federal government. There was almost as much animosity among those different denominations back, but they somehow put it together and extracted a common fund, if you will, of values that they build on. And again, I'm an optimist about that. Maybe I'm an optimist because I work with so many young people, If I was working just with old geezers like myself, I might not be so optimistic. But I am constantly buoyed up by the hopefulness and just energy and open-mindedness, if you will, of all these people, the students that I work with. My voice is getting pretty close to the end here, David. One more?
Can you do one more?
Yeah.
One more on the very back, and this is the last one.
First of all, I find out there are, in fact, mosques in Huntsville.
Yeah, first thing you said, there are mosques in Huntsville. And second of all, the question related to the latest recent election and trying to determine Mormonism and Christianity and evangelicalism and how does all this fit together, and is this an example, he was asking, I believe, of some of the differences between faith and belief. Did I get that close
enough.
In summary? Okay.
You know, I don't know in the final analysis whether Mitt Romney's being a Mormon made much difference in this election. I just don't know whether it did or not. How many people here think it did make a difference? Very few. Look at that. I don't think it did. And I'm a little surprised about that because there was a time not too long ago when large numbers among evangelical Christians, especially in the South, didn't think Mormons were Christians of any sort and would have been very, very suspicious of having a Mormon to be president of the United States. Now, I don't know what happened in the election. It hardly ever came up. Nobody ever brought up the fact that Mitt Romney's grandfather, who we talked about, who went to Mexico, went there because he wanted to continue to practice polygamy. And maybe there are certain subjects you stay away from, I guess, in a political campaign. But I think it's a kind of mark of American religious maturity coming along that was not a bar to office for Governor Romney. Now, Governor Romney, I refer to him as governor. He's governor of our state for a while. And it didn't come up when he was elected governor of Massachusetts at all. A heavily Catholic state, but with a lot of evangelical Protestants there. I see it as again, yet another sign of the increasing willingness to accept an element of religious diversity and pluralism in American society. I think it's to be welcomed. Now, he didn't win, but he did. That wasn't the reason why he lost, I'm sure. There were other reasons that figured in, but not his religious affiliation. No.
Let's say thank you.
Thank you.
You want a bottle of water?
Yeah. Thank you.
Following our program tonight, Dr. Cox, why don't you just make your way back to the book table there. As he says, Christmas is on the way. The paperback books, and I think you would put a signature in them if you would like to do that.
The signature